Hi, everyone. My name is Anita Modi. I'm the founder and CEO here at Peer AI. As quick background on Peer, we are delivering the easiest path to automation of regulatory documents. We are applying AI to author documents across preclinical, CMC, and clinical, everything from protocols to narratives, CSRs, INDs, and more. And since our founding about 2 years ago, we've been working with emerging biotech, larger pharma, and global CROs to show the value of applying AI across documentation, both as we talk about efficiency as well as quality. And you can learn more at www.getpeer.ai. And as we sit here today, mid 2025, about 2 years after starting Peer, I think it's clear that AI is rewriting the medical writing playbook. And what started as smarter document drafting has really been a catalyst for, I would say, broader organization wide change. And I think that's clear that there's still huge upside to seize. Having been a part of innovation waves and technology led innovation waves, I think we know that technology isn't enough. And it's really organizational readiness and leadership courage that decides who captures the value and how much of that value is actually recognized as well. So today in this webinar, that's the side of the equation that we'll jump into. We'll talk about practical change management tactics, internal playbooks for successfully rolling out AI, and most importantly, how medical writers are stepping in as the next generation of cross-functional leaders. And I can think of no one better than Sarah Wilson to guide us through this conversation. Sarah is the head of medical writing at Wave Life Sciences and formerly head of medical writing at Alkermes as well. And I'm really excited for the insights she's going to share. So with that, let's dive in. Sarah, do you mind? Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Do you mind starting with a quick introduction of yourself for our audience?
Sure. Thank you, Anita. I'm Sarah Wilson. I have been in the pharma industry now for about 20 years. I'm currently a senior director of medical writing at Wave Life Sciences. I just started there at the end of March, so it's still relatively recent. Prior to that, I was the head of medical writing at Alkermes for 3.5 years. And before that, I've worked at like AbbVie and Allergan and even in a clinical scientist role previous to that. So various roles in medical writing and clinical science within the industry. In terms of AI experience, I've actually should disclose that I've been doing consulting for Peer for the last year and a half. And while I was at Alkermes, I had the opportunity to do a in-depth project looking at different AI providers and trying to determine what would be the best one for using as document writing. So happy to move forward and answer some questions.
Yeah. So, Sarah, to orient us a little bit, you wanted your perspective. How did medical writers become the unexpected champions, let's say, of AI transformation in pharma? And from your perspective, having been in now multiple sort of types of companies in medical writing roles, what unique advantages or experiences do you think medical writers bring to really leading this charge?
Yeah, so I think, pharma as a whole, we're interested in AI in a whole number of different areas. I think probably almost every pharma company at this point, big and small, has some sort of R&D AI team or, other kind of organizational wide AI team that's looking into potential use cases. And one of the use cases that I think is most popular and makes a lot of sense is document writing. And I think that's where medical writing comes in. So we are in a really great position. We're obviously writing documents. The documents we're writing tend to be higher risk. We're in the clinical stage of development. I'm in clinical regulatory writing. I should have mentioned that. There's lots of types of medical writing. But I think in particular for clinical regulatory writing, you're putting documents together for the FDA and other health authorities. So but we're really in a position that we're putting things together that will be both looking at the regulatory side as well as the clinical side. We're bringing in the non-clinical side. So we're really working cross-functionally and have an ability within the organization to put all of those different pieces together. And I think that's why we are kind of brought into this organization-wide AI. And it's somewhat surprising, but I guess not really, because it sort of makes sense when you think about the fact that, we touch so many different parts of the organization. And then obviously that document writing is such a prevalent and popular use case.
Yeah, in essence, I think what we've seen is by default, to your point of this being one of the top use cases, medical writers were sort of forced to become the early adopters, and it's helped them essentially like shape the framework for how to think about ROI? Or we see in a lot of our conversations, medical writers weighing in or driving the conversation on things like usability or the type of integrations you need, or how do you measure value, because they have this sort of natural cross-functional lens as well. In your experience, I guess taking that now forward into implementation, are there specific frameworks or change management strategies that have proven sort of the most effective, when medical writers kind of lead these efforts around AI implementation, whether it's in regulatory, clinical, or even commercial functions as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think change management, no matter what it is, sort of has a certain set of rules, if you will. In general, there's always going to be people that are opposed to change. There's going to be people that are kind of the early adopters and are excited about change. And I think you have to sort of navigate that like you would any other big organizational change. So I think in this situation, when you think about using AI for clinical regulatory writing in particular, we're dealing with high risk documents, things like CSRs, submission documents, they're make or break. Like if we submit to a regulatory agency and it's an unclear document, we might not get approval for our drug, and that's obviously not good for our company. So I think we're in a position that we're writing really important documents. They have very clear regulations associated with them. They're clinical, so you're dealing with human subjects. So the risk there is a little different than, say, like more early phase research. And I
Yeah.
think when you're talking about getting people to adopt it, you have to show people that it works and that it's going to meet compliance standards. I think you're always going to have people that are going to doubt whether or not this is going to be the right thing for the organization. Are we moving too quickly? Are we ready for this? So I think you kind of have to bring people in, and just like with any change, baby steps, I think, are the best way to start and kind of get people used to it little by little. Both at my organization now and my previous organization, I've had the opportunity to use Copilot across the organization. I think that's like a really great way to get people sort of started with AI in their work life, whether that's using it with making an Excel formula or summarizing their emails or some little thing. Like the more that you start using AI, I think the more comfortable people are. And then when you start asking them to get used to it from a standpoint of doing something a little more complicated, like creating the draft one of a CSR, they're a little more ready to accept that change, especially for the writers and others that are going to have to um, think about how to adopt this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like, we talk a lot about it's one of the first things we dive into with customers, even before we get into medical writing. Like, what does AI literacy look like at your company, right? Um, because I think you're right. There's a lot of fear that sometimes exists, and even starting with some basic use cases, like you mentioned, whether it's enterprise ChatGPT or Copilot, or just getting to something general, it just starts the foundation and almost the conversation around what AI even means, let alone getting into benchmarks or top use cases. Our advice is always just get started somewhere, somewhere small, and start to bring your organization along. I don't know if that's been kind of your experience, but I think that really is valuable. And I guess in that vein, I think we started to talk about this a little bit. um, you mentioned value, right? Like show people that it works, or show what the power is. How do you think about measuring that or communicating the ROI of AI initiatives, especially to skeptical stakeholders that might exist internally? And do you have a point of view on which metrics are, the most compelling when you start to talk about bringing in AI to your executive team?
Yeah, yeah, this one's an easy one for me because I feel like I'm a skeptical stakeholder. I've been working with all of you for what, a year and a half, and I feel like at every turn I'm like, is that really going to work? That looks interesting, but I want to see how it works. And the same thing when I was at Alkermes and we would look at different technologies. Some of them you would watch a demo and you're like, oh, there's no way that that's going to work. Or you would do a pilot and it didn't come out quite the way you would think. So I've been very skeptical that this will actually save time. My big fear is that, yes, maybe you get to a draft one faster, but maybe you have to rewrite it. So am I
Mhm.
really saving time? Or maybe the quality is low. So the QC at the end is going to take longer. So I think when you think about the ROI, it can't just be this one little piece. Like document generation is about the whole life cycle of the document from beginning to end, from developing the shell and thinking about what's going to go into the document all the way through the final steps of formatting and QC and everything in between. And if at one point you save time just to add time in another point, you're not actually saving time. You're just kind of moving it around along that life cycle. So I think that's one piece of it, is that you have to actually be increasing efficiency. And the obvious part of that is you don't want to sacrifice quality while you do that. So I think figuring out, can that work, is the key element. And if you can show that, then I think you can turn a skeptical stakeholder into a believer. And the example that I have that I'd like to talk about is in May, I was presenting with Ravi at Pure about the pilot that I did at Alkermes, and it was a very complicated CSR. It was a 6-part CSR, essentially like 4 studies in one of these Frankenstein studies where you keep adding on protocol amendments and essentially making multiple studies out of one. And I wanted to break the system. So this was our pilot with Pure. And I thought, this is the hardest CSR. If they can write this CSR, they can write any kind of CSR. And we sent that over to them, worked with them to do the shell, to create the actual first draft. And what we got back was actually quite impressive. Just from a high level, it was a better draft than some of the things I've seen come out of a CRO before by a manual writer. So I was very impressed by it. Sure, there were some things wrong with it and, some things here and there that could be improved. But I would assume that if you were able to give that feedback to the system, the next one would improve the time savings was really incredible. So this particular CSR took us almost 5 months to put together, just because the writer was kind of on and off the project, but we figured out it was probably about 40 working days. And you think about it.
Oop. Sarah, we may have lost you there. Uh, Give it a second to reconnect. Sarah, if you can hear me, I think you cut out. All right, Sarah, I think you cut out, but it looks like we have you back.
All right.
Just as you were getting to the exciting metrics.
Okay, so I was at the metrics portion. Okay, I was wondering because I kept talking and then suddenly it went, whoop. All right. So anyway, in terms of the metrics, did you hear anything that I said, or
Maybe
it's
if you
cut
could
out
just
right?
reshare that, because I think it's a great framework for evaluation.
Okay, I will. And if you have to listen to me twice, then so be it. All right. So what we were putting together was a complicated 6-part CSR, and in terms of what we got back, I was really impressed because it was really high quality. I've seen first drafts come from inexperienced CROs that were not in as good of shape as this particular one. It really looked good from a quality standpoint. And when you think about the efficiency standpoint, it was quite impressive. So this particular CSR, like I mentioned, it's 4 parts. It was kind of like 4 studies. We figured it took us about 40 working days to put it together, which is a lot of time for a CSR. But when you think about it being really like 4 in 1, that's really a couple weeks per kind of study that was within the 6-part CSR. Um, Altogether, that took us like 5 months because obviously this poor writer had other priorities at other times. But the amount of time was a lot to put this together. And when we worked with Pure, the entire process, including creating the shell and putting together the data into the first draft from end to end, was only about a month, and it was about 17 working days from both the Pure side and the Alchemy side in terms of the inputs that we put in on both ends. So you can see going from 40 days down to 17 days is a pretty compelling efficiency gain. And I think there was also a quality gain there, like potentially there were a few things that could have been improved, but I do think if we were to do it again, once you give the AI that feedback, hopefully the next round would be even better. So I think, you can get to a place of having really high quality as well. Um, and then the last point I was going to make on this one is that when you think about using AI, it's not even just like within this document or creating a first draft. There's a lot of other things that happen when we're writing. And, right now, content reuse is a big topic, right? Like you take content from one document and you pop it in another document, but we all know it rarely gets left untouched. As soon as you put that back in front of your stakeholders, people are modifying the content. And sometimes they modify it in a way that maybe doesn't make as much sense as it was initially, or maybe puts us into an unintended story, or in a protocol causes an unintended consequence in terms of the way that we're approaching the design of the protocol. And what I think AI can do really nicely is flag things across documents. And if you're able to
Mhm.
do that, you can make more educated decisions about, is this a change we really want to make, or should we just revert back to the original text? And that's really hard for a manual QC reviewer or writer to do. We're often working in really tight timelines. We barely can do a good check within a document, let alone across documents. And I think ultimately this should lead to higher quality and potentially fewer protocol amendments, for example. So there's
Mhm.
definitely a lot that I think this can offer. And going back to how you compel your C-suite executives, if you save them time and you save them money in terms of getting a submission out earlier with less cost, I think it's a pretty easy story at that point.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think one of the first discussions I remember having with you was what does good quality look like, right? And being really clear about that from the onset to say, how do you know what a good CSR versus a not great CSR is? And it's one of the things we've done here at Peers is actually we interviewed hundreds of medical writers and said, great, what does good mean to you? And sort of boiled it up to like the to metrics and a framework that I think in our pilot we measured against, right? Accuracy, looking at completeness, readability, or like you said, consistency within documents and beyond. Because if you think about exactly how content travels, that's so critical. And I appreciate you sharing kind of the example of where that came to life. I will say your point about learning and continuing to improve is so spot on. And I think that's one of the unique things with AI, when you're working with humans, you have to sort of retain the best practice and remember to apply it next time. We're actually working with a larger pharma, and we've seen now, I think we're on the fourth CSR, but every CSR we've seen both increases in efficiency, like how quickly we're able to draft that. I think we're down to 5 days or so now, but also improvement in quality because every time you have that feedback, now that becomes sort of rules or configurations that are applied before as well. And so for me as a technologist and a product person, I think AI is giving us a different way to look at both quality and efficiency because of the intelligence that's there. That's not something you've been able to do in historical tech paradigms as well. So I agree with you that that sort of changes how you're able to even think about ROI.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anything else you wanted to share there on
No,
Pitch?
I just think that's fascinating because it's exactly what I would have expected, that the
Mm-hmm.
more that you went through those iterations, the better it would get. So, hopefully get to move further along now that I'm in a new company. I get to start over, but I will hopefully get to see that and have that experience like that company has had.
I'm seeing questions come in, which is great. So please keep them coming, and we'll turn over to the questions towards the end. Um, So, Sarah, as AI just becomes so integral to farm operations, I think it's clear this is the way forward. How do you see medical writers in particular establishing themselves as, call it the architects of AI governance and compliance standards across the organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think people get nervous when they think about AI
Yeah.
writing documents. We've all seen examples. I think there was a recent Health and Human Services report that
Yeah.
some pretty big examples of AI likely putting some errors in. And so I think the important thing to remember is we still own the documents, the
Hmm.
people, the team. this is not AI writing end to end. This is AI as a tool. It's not unlike any other word processing tool. I think about things like spell check or, other tools like Perfect It and things that people are using. Those are tools to make us write the document more efficiently, but we're not letting those tools just change things without overseeing what they're doing, and it's sort of the same thing with the AI. Like we still need to own the document. We need to be doing our own QC. We need to be reviewing each draft as a team and making changes according to what, you know, is needed for the document. So because of that, like you are still owning the SOP, you are still owning the
Mhm.
compliance process. And I don't think using AI is any different from any other tool. I think where you might get into risk is if you were to, let's say, replace your QC process with an AI
Mhm.
QC. I wouldn't recommend doing that, especially not at this stage, because then you are giving away some portion of, what your ownership is in the process
Yeah.
to AI. So I think as long as you still kind of retain ownership of all the key pieces along your process and your document generation, I think it makes sense to continue. And I think the other part of it, as we think about how we're putting our documents together, we've all heard that the FDA has its new tool that they're using to start reviewing documents. So, um, I think that the way that we write documents is going to need to change, not unlike when we had the ECTD come into play. The way that we used to
Mhm.
write for written documents when you have binders that you submitted is very different than how we write now, knowing that we're in electronic format. We rely a lot more on hyperlinking, for example, now than we used to. I think we're going to have to change again, to kind of acknowledge that now AI reviewers instead of human eyes are going to be looking at our documents. What those
Yeah.
changes are, I'm not really completely sure yet, but I think it's definitely something to start thinking about.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. What we at Peer, kind of the way we've always thought about it is what is like the human AI verification loop, right? You have AI do a bunch of work. Maybe it's, for example, creating the document roadmap, and then you have a human reviewer check it, make sure course correct, make sure it's not totally going down the wrong rabbit hole, address it, and then you have AI do a bunch of the authoring, and then you have a human review. And I think that's how we see the future, like leverage AI where it's possible, but make sure you have the appropriate, we call them human control points, to make
Mhm.
sure you're bringing in the expert lens, you're addressing things, you're taking account of source that the AI systems may not have, and other important context as well. And so I agree with you. I think in this new future you have to think about designing product and workflows to have that sort of human oversight and review, see where you can enable review so it's not as um, painful, and maybe it's risk appropriate, and recognizing where kind of AI automate too. But I think we've been really pleasantly surprised around how to balance those, and ensuring you have kind of team or advisors who can help you think about that. I guess thinking a little bit more about sort of this future of or kind of how compliance and innovation fit together. I know you've been part of different governance boards at your companies as well. Can you talk a little bit about what those look like and what the medical writer's role is um, at that organizational level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is an interesting shift. In the past, I don't think medical writing was ever invited to be on like an IT governance board. I just don't think that that happened. And now I've been on two governance boards for AI, at both Alkermes and now at Wave. And I think that is a shift. And I do think that the reason is that, you know, we are in medical writing in sort of a unique position in the company. Like we touch
Mhm.
a lot of different functions. Um, I just was in a wave last week in person, and it was sort of like an eye-opening experience where I'm like, oh, I'm so new, but yet I've already know all of these different people
Right.
from interacting with them through various documents. So you get to query and clinical and clinops and um, also in biostats, obviously. And then obviously you also have like the functional areas like HR and legal and IT and all of these different things. So you're kind of like in this unique position where you really understand not only just drug development end to end, but you also understand like how all the different functions contribute.
Mhm.
I think that makes us a valuable addition to these teams. And so, I really think that it, our roles are shifting a little bit in medical writing, and like we're going to have to sort of acknowledge that. And um, being a part of that leadership is one element of it, but I do think in medical writing, it's sort of like you have to start embracing AI and kind of the next phase of sort of tech, I think. So part of that is just having a willingness to learn and being open to what's new. And I think that's where we come in and bring kind of that insight into these governance teams.
Yeah, I think we've seen that a lot too with I kind of alluded to this earlier, medical writers showing, this is how you need the systems to be implemented, and here's who's going to do what, and we'll put together the work instructions, the SOPs, and work with IT and legal. And medical writers are grilling us on, security and compliance and those pieces. And it's incredible to see, those disciplines that, at least in my experience, have always been historically so siloed, really come together because this is sort of cross-functional in nature.
Mhm.
Um, which maybe brings me to, I guess, my last question, which is we're talking a lot about kind of organizational change here. Um, what surprising organizational shifts have you observed as medical writers take on even more sort of AI-driven kind of leadership roles, whether it's reporting structures or these sort of cross-functional team dynamics? And how do you prepare? Like, what would your advice be for folks here on how to prepare for kind of these cultural changes as well?
Yeah. So when I think about this cultural shift, I think about um, when we all started using the internet. I'm going to date myself a little. But it was funny. I was actually having a conversation just a few days ago with some of my colleagues, and we all remembered getting the internet. And for most of us, it was while we were in school, and it was really exciting. It was this big new thing. And here it is, like 30 years later, basically. And we all remember that moment when we were finally like, oh, wow, we have access to the internet. It's so exciting. And I feel like AI is that thing happening again. And just imagine today if you had said, I refuse to learn about the internet and I'm
Mhm.
not going to use that. Like you would be completely left behind. And I feel like that's going to be how it is with AI. I don't think it's going to change the way we work immediately, but I do think it will change the way we work over time till it becomes something that's just a tool we use, just like, we shifted to everybody using the internet constantly. We can't even live without Googling something for, 5 minutes. So I think people need to just recognize that and start working on their AI literacy, whether it's using Chat GPT because you have something that you think of at home or sorting pictures on your phone or whatever thing you can think of. But the more that you bring, the use of AI into your everyday life, I think that's going to help you to feel more comfortable with it. And I
Yeah.
think also just thinking about how can I get involved at work? So for me, I, jumped on the opportunity, for example, to do consulting with peer because I have felt like that has helped me to kind of understand how AI is coming into this space. I've also jumped at the opportunity to be on like my governance boards for R&D AI at both companies, and I feel like the more you can open yourself to these types of opportunities and learning, the better positioned you'll be for whatever the future brings. Because I do think the way we work is going to change, and at some point, hiring practices are going to reflect that. And if you don't have experience with AI or you are completely like against it, like I'm not going to use this, it's
Right.
something that might affect your ability to get your next position. So I do think that it's something that we need to be thinking about as medical writers. Like, how do we integrate this into our everyday lives?
Have you seen, sorry, I guess not last question. This will be the real last question. There's always this idea of like employees who are fearful or worried about their job. And how do you think about that thread within an organization?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of like the elephant in the room, right? Like
Yeah.
we can talk about AI in a positive way, but there's also negatives. And I
Hmm.
think one of them, and it's a real negative, is when you think about some of the work, especially work that maybe would have been done by junior writers,
Yeah.
is is being done now by a machine. So I think anyone in kind of a white collar position is thinking about it. But for those of us in medical writing, I think my big concerns are how does this change learning how to be a medical writer? So, for
Hmm.
example, if now narratives are all being written by AI tech, what those were often something that an early medical writer would put together. So like, where do they learn? So that is the thing that I think we have to address. I think the concern that people are going to lose their jobs is probably not a big issue because I think there's likely more work. I mean, I know personally, I've never been in a situation where I had enough time to do all the work I need to do in medical writing. And I feel like most people are like that. So I'm hoping it's a tool that helps our work-life balance, to be honest. I don't think there's enough people with our skill set in the industry
Mhm.
that we would be in a position of losing our jobs. But I do think what you might see is companies hiring fewer people. And when they hire fewer people, it might be fewer junior people. And I do think that there's a long-term impact of that, right? And I don't know exactly how to address it, but I do think that's something that we'll have to think about. Like, how do people get started?
Or-
Because we don't want to be in a position 20 years from now where all the people that would have kind of gotten started and are now the experienced people didn't have that opportunity because kind of AI was in that space.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, obviously we believe in the power of AI and have seen the value, but a human is required in the loop. Like human oversight is critical, and I don't see us ever being at a point that medical writers will be replaced. But to your point, I think it does change the role of the medical writer, and our hope, or what we've started to see with some of our customers, is almost frees them up to do other parts of the job where they don't have the time, like the strategic parts or the cross-functional um, collaboration or bringing the group together, which requires time and thought.
Yeah.
um, to your point, it does change the role. And I think what this conversation is sort of underlying for me is that medical writers have such credibility already in organizations, because to your point of where they sit and they touch on different functional areas. And I almost see them leveraging that credibility now to drive this next sort of shift and this change and how to guide their organization through thoughtfully making those transformations as well. And almost like there's an inherent trust factor that sits with medical writers, and I'm really excited to see so many of them now at the helm of this next wave of transformation as well. Well, thank you, Sarah, for sharing kind of your perspective and doing so from multiple roles. I already see some questions coming in, so we can start to answer them, and I encourage the audience to add any other questions that may be top of mind for you as well. Uh, all right, I'm gonna hit the first one. So, Sarah, there's a question here that says, as a change leader, how have you built the cross-functional relationships with IT or data science, for example? Um, this sounds like this organization is thinking of adopting AI for medical writing, and they'd love the insight of how to bridge that gap.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of just basic relationship building 101, right? Like, no matter what you're trying to do, you have to build relationships. We all know that's like a key part of getting anything done in any organization. So, obviously, bringing them in early, making them a key stakeholder in your project. For example, when I was doing our request for proposals last year for different AI document writing techs, my IT team was a key stakeholder in that process. You know, they own a piece of it, as do legal and other functional areas. So it's, I think the earlier you bring people in and get their buy-in and ensure that you're going in the right direction cross-functionally, the better it'll be. If you wait until the last minute and you've already made your decision and you didn't bring them in, be prepared that you're going to have a lot of back work to do to bring them up to speed, right? So, and they may or may not agree with the way that you thought about it, because I think every function looks at it a little bit differently. You know, there, what was eye-opening to me is, the legal and IT concerns were often things
Mhm.
that I didn't even know were concerns, because that's not even my expertise. So I really do recommend, building that partnership and bringing them in early.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, next question I see here. So metrics of time savings and quality on the Peer CSR pilot that you shared, Sarah, were compelling. What other benchmarks should this organization consider to show the real value of AI? You talked about amendments. Are there others that they should think about?
Yeah, I think this is sort of one of those things that's kind of under development. Another one of those building the plane as you fly it sort of thing, because you're kind of figuring out what your benefits are as you as you go through it. I think like, you know, at the very base level, as I've already said, it's really about increasing your efficiency without sacrificing quality. So, how you measure those two things, I think can be done in different ways. I mean, time savings is obviously easy, but again, you need to really look at time savings at the big picture of time savings, not just a piece of the pie, because I think you can miss out if, for example, you save time on drafting draft one, but your writer spends 2 weeks fixing the draft. That almost might be more time than they would have spent writing it from scratch. So, you really need to think about that whole part of the time savings. And then quality is also tricky because there's different elements of quality, right? Like there's the just pure data quality. Yes, it's correct, it's grammatically correct, it's written in an understandable way, but also it's kind of like the softer, more
Hmm.
qualitative aspect of it. And this one's a harder one to measure, but like it's like it when you see it. When you read something and you're like, oh, that made sense. And they pulled the right pieces out to make a comment. So for example, you usually have a table in a document and you're pulling out the key pieces of information. In some cases, it might just pull something random and you're like, why would it do that? That makes no sense. So you want to make sure that it's kind of pulling out those things that are relevant and make sense.
Hmm.
That's somewhat of a judgment call. So I think it's hard to like just measure that easily. It's like I said, a little more qualitative, but it's sort of like it when you see it. Like you read something, you're like, oh, that made sense. That was put together well. And I think the more that you go through iterations, like the better you'll get at being able to see that.
Yeah. And maybe some things to add from how we've seen customers think about ROI. I think your point is spot on that it's end to end. I think often we see people talking about, okay, it takes 2 minutes to generate this or 30 seconds, but discount the all of the configuration or the setup or how does it scale, right? And so to your point, we think about what's the end-to-end measurement, all the way from let's configure this for your study, for your specific document type, for your company's template, your style guides, all those pieces, and like really look at it holistically. And then how do you think about now scaling that across your organization? Like, great, you have a data point for your first CSR. Does it get better in your second CSR, your third CSR? And now what if you're adding safety narratives and protocols and all these others? How do you think about scaling beyond? And we truly believe there is compounding efficiency as you look across document types and measure the end to end too. But I think it does require you to have that sort of like holistic lens, which often is not even going to be seen in a pilot, right? You're getting familiar, but you're starting to extrapolate into like the ROI beyond that too. And another question, I know we had talked about this previously, is what does quality now look like with the FDA starting to use AI? You almost have a human reviewer and potentially an AI reviewer on the other end, which also changes kind of the lens of what quality means too. And I don't know if you've started to think about that. Um, but it's a discussion we're seeing with a lot of our customers to say, okay, if AI is going to check for these three things, how do you appear, make sure you're already screening for it or checking those things, in advance?
Yeah, I think we all should be thinking about it. I know I've been thinking about it. I don't know that I've got it figured out. I don't think any of us do. I imagine it'll be not unlike any other new regulatory process where it's sort of like you figure out by doing, like as people give more submissions, we'll start to get more feedback and we'll start to understand like what direction do we need to take.
Yeah.
So I think time will tell from that standpoint, but I think, just me thinking about it, I think about things like I'm really into lean writing, love
Hmm.
writing, but part of lean writing is really focusing on like hyperlinking. Maybe
Yeah.
that doesn't work as well with AI. Is AI going to be able to like go through the ECT structure and go to the link and pull out the right piece of information? Or is it better to start putting things back in the documents, as much as I hate to say that? But you could see a reason to start putting more information back into the body of the document potentially, because it
Hmm.
might make it more machine readable.
Hmm.
And I, and that's where using AI is going to come in handy, because nobody wants to be, copy and pasting all of that information in. But I think
Right.
that's where AI can come in to make it, if AI is putting it together, it's probably going to be more AI friendly from the reading standpoint. So I do think like those things are going to go hand in hand. I think
Yeah.
exactly how it plays out, none of us really are going to know. And I think early reports sound like maybe they were a bit premature at the FDA in adopting things, so it's probably a bit clunky, but I think we'll wait and see what
Yeah.
happens.
And I think we should assume it is coming, right? Like this is going to play out. All right. While we're on the topic of quality, there's another question here from Helen. You made a great point regarding QC. Even with Perfect It, you have to go through and look at each correction individually to ensure that's what you want. Also, in areas where interpretation is required, such as summaries where citations are used, a person has to look at those to be sure it says what you're intended. So great. I don't know if there's any other commentary you wanted to add there, Sarah, but it looks like you have a audience member agreeing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think absolutely. And so if we think about this the same way as we think about those tools, I think we'll stay out of trouble. I think where people get into trouble is they say, oh, the AI wrote it. I'm good to go. Wash my hands and submit it. And you can't do that, just like you wouldn't do it for any other tool. So I think as long as we stay where we own it, we're reviewing it just like we would if it was a junior writer or another tool. You treat it that way. You wouldn't just send it
Right.
out without taking a, a look at it.
Yeah. In that vein, I'm going to take these next two questions together. I guess we've been talking about how regulators are starting to use AI themselves. Should medical writer roles also evolve, and are there proactive strategies that this organization should think about putting in place? And I think it goes hand in hand with this next question, which is courses or certifications to upskill medical writing and integrate AI. So maybe stepping back, how can any tactical advice um, for these organizations to think about with their medical writing teams?
Yeah, that's interesting. Like I think first comes to mind is like AMWA's certificate and
Mm-hmm.
medical writing program. And
Yep.
I know Ravi at Peer has been involved. There's like a cross company um, group at AMWA that's like kind of working on the AI and medical writing
Yeah.
strategy. Maybe that's something that they look at is like what education, whether it's adding on to the existing certificate program or its own webinars and own courses. But I do think this is definitely an area that we need to address. And what I have noticed, if you go to the AMWA conferences, whether it's your local conference or the national conference, it is more and more AI.
Mhm.
Like a few years ago, you didn't really hear much about this, and now it's like almost it's hard to cover every session because they might be happening at the same time, sort of
Yeah.
situation. So it's definitely shifting, and I think there's a recognition of that as an industry we need to learn more. Um, so I think just kind of stay tuned, and I think AMLA is a great resource. I think the other resources are just like people, relationships. Like, what are your peers doing at other companies? I think it's always good to keep in touch with people, which that kind of networking and collaboration is a good way of learning how we're all handling these changes.
Yeah. Yeah. I echo that on the AMWA AI task force has been really thoughtful about how to bring in this thread and think about a lot of these questions we're talking about, right? What does the future of kind of medical writing look like, and how do you prepare the especially junior medical writers kind of entering this field? I think my advice, or what I've heard at organizations, again, just get started, right? Like the best way for medical writers to upskill is to play around, and you start to really see both the power and the limitations of AI today. Um, and I'll say, we appear specifically built our company with medical writers in house, from the get go. Because at the end of the day, the best kind of product ideas and creative ideas have actually come from our medical writers just playing with AI and saying, "Oh, look at like what else you can do in these different things," which is really powerful. But I echo that. All right, one more question we have here. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing such great real world perspective. Document drafts are, of course, based on data. I'm curious what your thoughts are on using internal and or external intelligence information to also influence the content.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of the garbage in, garbage out. So as long
Yeah.
as you make sure it's not garbage, you're fine. So that's where I think the difference between something like ChatGPT that's bringing in information from everywhere, you're often getting more of the hallucinations and kind of the garbage, if you will, because it's not picking from the correct
Yeah.
sources, or it's even making them up in some cases. So that is not the approach. I think you definitely need to be in some sort of a closed system. Um, I think most of the document writing platforms like Peer and all of the other ones that I've looked at are within these sort of closed system. You give them all of the source documents. So I think as long as you treat it just like you would if you were outsourcing to a CRO and you were like, these are the 10 references I want you to use, and um, this is the USPI I want you to cite, and whatever it is, like you provide it, I think you'll be fine. Yeah, I think you can really use anything as a source document, just like you would with writing, as long as you are ensuring that it's a quality source, just like you would if you were writing it manually.
Yeah, that's been our approach with customers. Treat us as a peer, right? Share whatever you would share with a partner or a writer that you were asking to help support you. But also, AI is not magic, right? It is only as good as the source information that's shared, and to be aware of that. And that's why I think it's so important to have a human in the loop as you go through it at every checkpoint, not just at the very end, to ensure you have that control. I'll open it up one last time for questions. I think we hit the ones that were in the chat. Oh, all right. One more question coming in from Georgina. Amazing input. Thank you, Sarah. Can you dive into the use of AI also on scientific writing, such as in scientific papers?
Yeah, I think Um, I'm obviously not as familiar on that side of things, but I do have regular meetings with the Med Affairs team because I think it's an obvious use case and potentially easier, honestly, because I feel like, let's say we're writing a journal CSR, if you provided the CSR and the appropriate reference documents, it seems like it should be put together pretty well. I've seen a number of different companies when I've gone to AmLaw that say they can do the authoring. I don't know if it works, but I think there is definitely potential. So I would say any kind of writing, there's whether it be report writing or journal article writing or clinical regulatory writing, there's definitely um, different ways to use AI.
Yeah. I'll echo that in some of our kind of R&D as we've expect to expand into medical affairs. We've seen the same, and I think it's such a natural extension again as you're talking about the way content kind of travels through to be able to service the continued sort of authoring as well. But I agree. I think AI is built well for scientific publications too. If there's any other questions, I encourage the audience to put them in the chat. But I think we hit most of them coming in. All right. Perfect. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this very quickly evolving frontier. And appreciate the engagement from the audience. Thank you for all of the questions. And appreciate you continuing this conversation with us. Thank you. All
Thanks, Anita. It was a pleasure to be a part of the conversation.
right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.